evening, everybody. It's good to see you all here. It's actually quite a decent crowd, this is. So this talk is going to be a little bit more serious than the previous one, because I'm going to be talking about something that is rather serious. I'll be talking about the war on cancer. So as you probably all know, cancer research has been going on for decades now. We have been looking for a cure for cancer for a while. And in fact, back in 1971, President Nixon signed the National Cancer Act. And this was basically a $1.6 billion funding for cancer research. And since this was such a large amount, it was as if he declared war on cancer. So we often still refer to it as the war on cancer. Well, this war is also, of course, also about the questions that ask, so what causes cancer and how can we cure it? And these are questions that really intrigue me because cancer is a very complicated disease. So I decided about 7 years ago to join this war. And if you join a war, of course you need weapons. So the weapon that I'll be using is mathematics. Yes. So I will be telling you about how mathematics can be used in the fight against cancer and how we can find a cure. And there's many ways to do that. There's many different battlefields to fight. But today I will be talking to you about radiotherapy. So first of all, what is radiotherapy? So to some of you this might seem an obvious question, but it absolutely isn't. Last year I went to a conference in London, and when I was on the plane back, I was sitting next to this American lady and we started chatting a little bit about our visits to London. So I told her about the conference, how I was at a conference related to radiotherapy, and I asked her, do you know what it is, radiotherapy? And she said to me, of course I do. Radiotherapy is a therapy where you use music delivered through the radio. Of course. Well, that's where I learned that in English, it's better not to say radiotherapy, but radiation therapy, just to be sure. So radiation therapy, what we do is we aim to kill tumor cells using radiation. And the treatment that you immediately think of is the treatment where a radioactive beam is directed at the tumor, so at the part of the patient's body where the tumor is. And today I want to discuss a slightly different form of radiation therapy, namely brachytherapy. And in this treatment, radiation is not delivered from outside the patient's body, but from within the tumor. So we have to put radioactive sources inside a patient's body. How does that work? We're going to look at the treatment, and since my research has been mostly on prostate cancer, I will use that as an example. Here we have a side section of a patient. And, oh, nope, that's not what I wanted to do. Anyway, so in black you see the prostate, and around it you have the healthy organs, such as the bladder and the urethra going through the prostate and the rectum. And when treatment starts, the first thing that happens is that the patient lies on the back, and this template over here is attached to the patient's perineum. And as you can see, this template contains a large number of holes. And some of these holes are then selected and used to insert needles all the way into the prostate. There's lots of empathy in this room, I like that. All right. It's getting better, people. So if you look at this in a 3D view, it looks like this. There on the lower right corner, you see how the patient lies. So his head is there, feet are here. And in green, the green blob, that is the prostate. And as you can see, through the prostate in yellow runs the urethra. And in brown, you see the rectum. And you also see all those dots there, which are the holes of the template. And then if you insert the needles, it looks like this. Really, you're the best audience ever. So as you can see, those needles are nicely, evenly spread over the prostate so that you can reach basically the whole of it. By the way, I forgot to tell you. So the tumor is usually spread in bits and pieces over the whole prostate. So we generally consider the whole prostate as the target volume. So I might use the terms prostate, target volume, or tumor interchangeably. I basically mean the same by that. All right. So then the needles are in place, and what happens next? So here the ellipsoid, that's the prostate. and you see the two needles, and these needles are hollow from the inside. So what happens next is that we take a tiny radioactive source and we move it into the first needle. It then stops at what we call a dwell position, and when it stops, it's radioactive. So it delivers radioactivity, a radioactive dose to the surrounding tissue. And it stops at several positions. And once it's finished with the first needle, it moves on to the next. If this source stops twice as long, then the delivered dose becomes twice as high. So that is a very nice and simple relationship. And if we're done with the treatment, we are left with a nice dose distribution. So here you see areas with a high dose, the dark red areas, and areas with a lower dose, the lighter red areas. So what does it look like in the treatment room? So I tried to crop the next picture as much as possible so that you will feel as comfortable as possible. In the top right, you see the patient with the template in position and the needles in position. And each of these needles is connected with a tube. Shall I skip this part? Okay, so it's connected with a tube to what we call the afterloader device. And this device is what inserts the radioactive source into the needle, makes it stop at the dwell positions, moves it on to the next dwell position, and retracts it again. So what we want to have is we want to deliver the prescription dose in the whole of the prostate, because we don't want any tumor cells to live on, because then you can start from the beginning. We also don't want to have too much dose in the prostate, because we don't want to get rid of it just yet. But delivering the prescribed dose is good. And of course, you don't want any dose outside the prostate. So this is the ideal situation. You're never going to get it, but we can try to get as close as possible. How are we going to do that? Well, for that, you have to make two decisions. First of all, you need to select the catheter locations. So you need to choose about 15 up to 20 of those holes to use for needle insertion. Well, suppose you would have had the proper amount of training and experience. What do you think? Would you be able to select just about the right holes to evenly spread them over the prostate? Who think that should be possible? 1, 2 people, very brave. Well, actually, you're right. This is done manually. You can do that manually pretty well. Next up, dwell times. How long should the source stop at each of these dwell positions? Well, there's about 10 up to 15 dwell positions per needle. So that means about 200 dwell positions in total, and you have to define the exact right amount of time to stop at each of these positions. If I would ask you to do that, how would you feel? I'd go like this. No way I'm going to do that. You are not going to be able to do that manually, so you definitely need a mathematical algorithm that determines the optimal stopping times at each of the dwell positions. So this is where mathematics come in. How does that work? So we go back to our schematic picture, and here you see the original dwell positions, and you see one additional point in the middle, which we call a dose calculation point. So guess what we're going to do there? We're going to calculate the dose delivered to this point. Well, this point receives dose from this dwell position, which we call dwell position J, and we call the calculation point I. And we know up front what the dose rate is, the amount of dose that is delivered if you stop the source for exactly 1 second. That means that the total dose delivered from this dwell position to that calculation point is equal to the dose per second times the stopping time. But of course, this point receives a dose from all the dwell positions. So if you add up all those individual dose contributions, you get the total dose in this calculation point. So now we know the dose in this one point, but of course we want to know the dose in lots of points spread out over the organs. So we define a whole bunch of calculation points, not just in the prostate, but also in the healthy tissues, namely the urethra and the rectum. And if you then know those doses, then you know a nice overall dose distribution, and you can start evaluating it. So if you have this dose distribution, how do you determine whether it's good? Well, I already mentioned that you want to have the whole prostate to receive the prescribed dose. So what we're going to do is we let the algorithm count how many of the calculation points receive the prescribed dose, at least. So, and that will be a fraction of the total tumor volume. And generally, we can achieve at least 95% of what we call tumor coverage. So at least 95% of the tumor will receive at least the prescribed dose. But that's not the only thing we look at, because of course there's a rectum down here as well. And I'm not quite sure if you can see it, but this rectum receives some dose too, and that's not good. We can reduce the dose to the rectum by reducing some of the dwell times. And this is what you get then. The dose in the rectum vanishes, but of course also the dose in the tumor goes down. And that's not what we want. So you basically see here that we need to make a trade-off between tumor dose on the one hand and rectum dose on the other hand. Let's take a closer look at this trade-off in a graph. Here on the horizontal axis you see the plan quality for the tumor. So this is quality, not dose. And on the vertical axis you see plan quality for the rectum. And of course we want to achieve a high quality, so top right corner is good, bottom left is not good. Let's evaluate some plans, shall we? Here are 3 plans, plans A, B, and C. And I would like you to think a little bit about what plan or plans would be good. So who would say, yeah, plan A looks like a decent plan? Nobody. 2 people, 3 people. 3 people who care about the rectum. Good. Who'd say plan B looks like a decent one? There's a few more. And who'd go for plan C? A lot of people suddenly. And there's some people who don't want to be treated at all. I can imagine that. All right. In fact, there's multiple decent options here. As you can see, plan A is very good for the rectum, but not so good for the tumor. And plan C is very good for the tumor, but not so good for the rectum. Which is just a different balance, a different trade-off. It's a matter of what you prefer. Plan B, however, is equally good for the tumor as plan A, but worse than plan B for the rectum. So that means that you should never choose plan B, because plan A is always better. So you only want to have treatment plans that are the best in terms of one of the goals. All right? And in fact, you can create a whole bunch of treatment plans that show you each different trade-offs. And if you give this to a treating physician, then he or she can select for this individual patient the best trade-off. And this is what we call Pareto optimal plans. The economists among you might know this term. Some of you might be thinking, what did you just say? Burrito optimal plans? No, this is not Mexican food. It's called Pareto optimal plans. Keep that in mind. All right, so this is how mathematics can help in treatment planning. So you would say, we're done, we're good. We can make a treatment plan. However, life is never as beautiful as it seems. Before treatment starts, what people do is they first make like a scan of the patient's abdomen. And this is one of those scans. And now an expert has to start indicating where the prostate is. To me, that looks quite difficult, so I asked an expert to do it for me. And he made the following delineation. He said the prostate is just about here. And I was like, yeah, sure. So I asked another expert, and she made the following delineation, which is slightly different. This difference looks quite small, but since we want to get rid of the whole of the tumor, and since radiation therapy is a high-precision treatment, this is bad. We should be alarmed here for sure. Because in fact, coverage, so the fraction of the volume that receives the prescribed dose, can go from above 95% to below 90%, and we don't want to have that. So we developed a solution for this. We adapted our algorithm such that it can handle these uncertainties. Back to our original treatment plan. Suppose that this is our treatment plan, and we have a delineation here. And in fact, this delineation could be different. Here are 3 other scenarios of where the prostate could actually be instead. Well, the one here on the lower right corner, if you run into that scenario, it's not that bad. It's just smaller, and it still receives sufficient amount of dose, so that's all right. But the other 2, you see that there's part of the volume that do not receive any dose. And that, of course, isn't good. So what we let our algorithm do is, every time it evaluates the quality of a treatment plan, we let it look at just one scenario, namely what is then the worst case scenario. And what the algorithm then does is it tries to optimize the treatment plan such that it is as good as possible in the worst case scenario. And this is where we thought, victory, we solved it. So when we came up with this model, I started coding, I implemented it. It was late in the evening, so I went back home. I would see the results the next morning. And calculating a treatment plan, so the algorithm, should not take more than 15 minutes, because you can imagine, patient is lying on the treatment couch. You don't want to leave him there forever. Really, it should be fast. When I came back to the office the next morning, I saw that the algorithm hadn't finished. In fact, it took several days, and for some patients, it even ran out of memory. So you can only imagine how I felt that morning. So, back to the beginning. We had to speed up our algorithm. There are many ways to speed up algorithms. There are technical methods, there are mathematical methods. But it's not all about mathematics. There's some common sense involved here as well. So I would like to share with you one trick that is related to common sense. We go back to our original picture with all the calculation points. Now, if you look at this, you see that there are some calculation points that are fairly close to the needles. And these calculation points are thus likely to receive a fairly high dose because they're close to the needles. When the algorithm optimizes the treatment plan, it has to calculate the dose in each calculation point for every single treatment plan it looks at. So you can imagine that if we would have fewer calculation points, optimization would go much faster because there's fewer calculations involved. So what we did is we excluded these calculation points from the analysis and only optimized for the other points. And you get a treatment plan, and of course we don't use that treatment plan for treating the patient because we might have made mistakes on these calculation points that we excluded. So we check whether we did make mistakes. If indeed those calculation points do not receive a high dose, we put some of them back into the algorithm and re-optimize. And we keep going back and forth. We keep doing that until we have a good plan that is good for all of the calculation points. And this actually made the model way faster. We did the same thing for calculation points that lie far away, because you can simply assume that they receive a low dose. And this made us actually reach this boundary of at most 15 minutes of calculation point. So that is where we were happy with the results. All right. So I just told you about using mathematics in brachytherapy treatment plan optimization. But that's not the only thing that mathematics can be used for in cancer treatment. You can also use it for external beam radiation therapy. And actually there, treatment planning is even more complicated. So mathematics is even more necessary. But also outside radiation therapy. I already talked about imaging. Imaging is very important for diagnostics, but also for treatment. And also there's a lot of mathematics involved. And then finally, there's two more fields that have been quite booming recently. The first is in DNA. So I think about 10 years ago, it has become rather cheap and easy to unravel the DNA of an individual, to read an individual's DNA. And this means that people have been building up databases, large databases, with the DNA of both healthy and diseased people. Another advance in research has been on big data. You probably heard of it. So if you combine those two, then you can analyze these huge DNA databases and figure out which genes, which mutations cause cancer. And which mutations cause cancer is also very important for the cure. Because, as you might know, a cure does help for one patient, but it doesn't for another. And this is likely to be related to which particular genes are involved for this patient. So also there, we use data analysis. So currently, I'm working on these last two fields. So I am still in the war on cancer. And I hope that together with all the other researchers in this field, we can eventually find a treatment and claim our victory. Thank you.